40 stories above Manhattan, in a tower that had his family's name bolted above the entrance in brushed titanium. Damian Sterling stood at the glass and watched a car pull into the circular drive below. He didn't move. He barely breathed. He just spoke 4 words to his cousin standing behind him. "She cannot be my bride." Then the car door opened, and everything, every assumption, every plan, every carefully built wall of emotional distance, fractured clean in two. But before we get to her, you need to understand what he was standing to lose. Because this isn't just a love story. This is a story about legacy, survival, a $200 million trap, and the most dangerous woman the Sterling family ever let through their front door. If you're new here, hit subscribe right now, because we do stories like this every single week, and you do not want to miss what's coming. Okay, let's get into it. Damian Sterling is 34 years old, chairman and CEO of Sterling Capital Group, one of the oldest, most powerful private equity dynasties on the Eastern Seaboard. His grandfather helped build the Manhattan skyline. His father sat on the boards of institutions most people only read about. On paper, Damian is untouchable. Off paper, he is 3 months from catastrophe. When his father died 2 years earlier, Damian inherited more than a name. He inherited a secret, hidden in a private agreement, not filed through the corporation, signed in his father's own hand, was a $200 million personal debt. The man holding it? Rosalind Fairfax, patriarch of the Fairfax Group, one of the only old money conglomerates in America powerful enough and ruthless enough to go toe-to-toe with the Sterlings. For 24 months, Damian had quietly bled, selling off assets, restructuring subsidiaries, keeping the worst of it away from the financial press. He was almost there, almost clean, and then Rosalind Fairfax made his move. He called in the note, all $200 million, and he attached one condition, marriage, to Rosalind Fairfax's niece, Rosalind Fairfax, within 60 days, that's right. A bride, not a business deal, a person. Specifically, a woman named Rosalind Fairfax, who, according to every background report, every whispered conversation in every private club in New York, had not been seen at a single public event since 2018. No press appearances, no family functions, not one photograph in 5 years. The official story? A fire at the Fairfax family's Connecticut compound in 2019. She was inside. She escaped, barely, and the trauma had apparently left her emotionally, psychologically unable to cope with public life. Her uncle kept her in a managed private arrangement at the Greenwich estate. For her own good, for her own comfort. That's what he told people. That was the story Damian was given. And you already know, because you're smart, that when a man like Rosalind Fairfax tells you a story, especially a story about someone he keeps locked away, you should be asking, whose comfort is this really for? But Damian had 300 employees. His mother's name was on charitable foundations across 4 states. He could not let Sterling Capital fall. So he did what the men in his family had always done when backed into a corner. He made the deal. Draft the acceptance, Margaret. I'll marry her. But she will remain in Greenwich if that is where she is comfortable. The marriage will be in name only. Name only. That was the plan. A quiet ceremony, a name on a certificate, and a firewall between his firm and ruin. He even had the East Wing guest suite prepared, the one with the river views. Something peaceful for a fragile woman. Something contained. And then October rain swept up the Hudson Valley, and a gunmetal gray town car pulled into the drive at Ashford Estate. And the rear door opened. Okay, here she is. Pay attention to everything about this moment, because every single detail matters. That a hand appeared first. Not trembling, not gloved, gripping the car door frame with an unhurried, startling confidence. Then a woman stepped out into the rain. She wore a deep burgundy coat, impeccably tailored, belted at the waist. The rain hit her the moment she cleared the car's shelter. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull her coat up, didn't duck her head, didn't rush. She turned her face up toward the facade of Ashford Estate and looked at it, the way you look at something you're considering buying. Not arriving, evaluating. Damian had spent the last 2 months mentally preparing to manage a tragedy. He had steeled himself on those entrance steps for fragility, for sunglasses, for the visible damage of someone kept away from the world. What he had not prepared for, what no amount of background reports or Margaret's careful phrasing had even hinted at, was this. High cheekbones, a jaw that could cut glass, dark, rain-damp hair pinned with obvious impatience, escaping at the temples. And then she turned and looked directly at him, and Damian felt the full force of it. Her eyes were a vivid, rain-washed green, and they contained not one grain of fragility, not one flicker of disconnection. They were sharp, measuring, entirely, terrifyingly lucid. She didn't look like a woman who'd been hidden out of compassion. She looked like a woman who'd been hidden because she was dangerous. His cousin Thomas, standing beside him, released a slow, stunned breath and said what they were both thinking. Damian walked down the steps without consciously deciding to, forgetting the umbrella his assistant tried to offer, forgetting the rain soaking into his jacket. He said her name. She said his. And then, in about 45 seconds flat, she established exactly who she was. He extended his arm to escort her inside. She glanced at it for exactly 1 second, and then walked straight past it, ascending the entrance steps without him, calling back over her shoulder that she'd appreciate coffee, since the driver had been instructed not to speak to her for 4 hours. Damian stood in the rain with his arm suspended uselessly in the cold air. And then he followed her into his own house. In the warm amber light of the entrance hall, surrounded by 4 generations of oil-painted Sterling ancestors, Rosalind Fairfax looked even more extraordinary and something else. Controlled. The way a person is controlled when they've learned, through absolute necessity, to reveal nothing. Near her left temple, barely visible beneath her dark hair, was a faint silver scar, thin as a thread, fading into her hairline. The only evidence, the only conceivable evidence, that she had ever been anywhere near a fire. She handed her coat to his stunned house assistant without looking at her. Then she leveled her eyes at Damian's, and she said this. "I am fully aware of the contract you signed with my uncle, Mr. Sterling. And I should tell you now, the terms are about to change." She turned and followed the housekeeper upstairs. Her heels were silent on the stone steps, and Damian stood in his entrance hall staring after her, with the sudden, crystalline understanding that he had not invited a wife into his home. He had invited a war. I need to know, are you already on her side? Drop a comment right now. Team Rosalind or Team Damian? Because I promise you, by the end of this video, your answer is going to change. Keep watching. At 8 o'clock, Rosalind walked into Ashford's study in a deep emerald dress, a color that matched her eyes so precisely it could not have been accidental, and sat down in the armchair across from the fireplace without being invited. And then she dismantled everything Damian thought he knew, sentence by sentence, with the calm of someone who had rehearsed this conversation approximately 10,000 times in her head before she was ever able to have it. You signed a contract believing you were acquiring a liability, a damaged, compliant woman you could warehouse in a guest wing while her uncle cleaned out her inheritance. My uncle told you I was psychologically fragile because a woman declared unstable cannot testify, cannot press legal claims, and cannot be believed. I was the perfect silent instrument for the most elegant theft I have ever witnessed. Let's walk through what she told him, because you need to understand the full picture. Her father was the original controlling partner of the Fairfax Group. When he died in 2015, her uncle Harrison took control. 3 months later, her mother died too. Rosalind was 22, alone, grieving, and completely unaware of what was already being done to her. Harrison Fairfax spent the next 4 years systematically dismantling her father's estate, diverting trust assets, rerouting them through shell companies and offshore vehicles, while Rosalind had no idea what was being taken. What was legally hers was being stolen in plain sight, buried under layers of corporate architecture specifically designed to be impossible to trace. But Rosalind was paying attention. In 2019, she got into her uncle's home office. She pulled a flash drive. 5 years of financial records, board minutes, wire transfers, shadow accounts at a private bank called Marchmont, documenting everything. Every dollar diverted, every falsified resolution, every rerouted payment. And then the fire happened. The Connecticut compound. 2019. The official story: an accidental fire, traumatic, her wing of the house, lucky escape. The real story: the fire started inside her wing. Accelerant traces found by the first investigators, consistent with deliberate ignition. A preliminary report that was quietly, methodically buried before it ever became official. The investigator who filed the final, falsified report resigned 4 months later and joined a consulting firm owned by a Fairfax subsidiary. Harrison Fairfax had tried to kill his own niece, and when that failed, he did the next best thing. He had her committed, 8 months in a private psychiatric facility. Not because she was unstable, because a documented psychiatric history is extraordinarily effective at preemptively discrediting a witness. When she was released back to Greenwich, the isolation simply continued. The staff were his. Her phone and internet access were managed. She was, for all practical purposes, a ghost, and now Damian saw it. The full architecture of it. Methodical, patient, brilliant in the way that truly corrupt things are brilliant. The marriage contract wasn't charity toward a damaged woman. It was the final piece of the machine. Under her father's estate agreement, Rosalind stood to inherit a trust valued at approximately $900 million. The entire consolidated asset base her father had spent 30 years building on her 30th birthday, or upon marriage, whichever came first. With one condition: the marriage required Harrison Fairfax's formal consent. Her birthday was 6 weeks away. He was out of time. He couldn't let her marry independently. She'd inherit the trust without him. He couldn't kill her again. So he found a man desperate enough to sign a contract, with a buried secondary clause routing management of her trust, once inherited, directly back to Marchmont Private, which was, in practice, Harrison Fairfax. He's paying me $180 million to be the instrument of a $900 million theft. Damian walked to the window. He stood there for a long time, and then he turned around and asked the question that mattered most. She had studied him. 4 years in a managed house in Greenwich, with a carefully monitored internet connection, and she had spent that time researching every person who might eventually be used against her. And she had found one she was willing to bet everything on. Then she laid out her proposal, and it was, I want you to understand this, one of the most precise, most elegant, most ruthlessly constructed plans you will ever hear. Marry her tomorrow. Accept the debt settlement. Sterling Capital needs it, and there is no shame in that. But do not sign the Marchmont addendum. As her husband, under the terms of her father's estate agreement, he becomes her legal next of kin. Her uncle's consent clause is fulfilled and simultaneously destroyed. Fairfax loses control of the trust the moment the marriage certificate is filed. And then, once Rosalind is legally protected from his immediate reach, she gives Damian the flash drive. They take it to the SEC, the DOJ, and the financial press, all at once, in a move too coordinated and too public for Fairfax to bury that we have a bargain. We marry tomorrow. We dismantle everything he built. Okay, he said, we negotiate that when the war is won. And she let him. She just let him say that. If you're as invested in these two as I am right now, smash that like button. We are not even at the gala yet. Stay with me. The next morning, the Ashford Chapel, a small, vaulted room from the 1890s, smelling of old stone and beeswax candles, narrow stained glass windows throwing fractured autumn light across the limestone floor. Rosalind did not wear white. There was no family to dress her, no one to perform the small kindnesses of a bridal morning. She wore deep navy, perfectly fitted, quietly severe, and she walked down the short aisle alone, at a pace that was neither hurried nor reluctant. The pace of a woman who had made her decision in full daylight and intended to execute it without sentiment. Her eyes met Damian's the moment she cleared the doorway, and they did not waver, not once. When it came to his vows, Damian's voice rang out with a finality that surprised even him. When it came to hers, 2 words: quiet, clear, absolute. Afterward, in the vestry, Margaret spread the documents across the table. Marriage certificate, debt discharge, settlement transfer, and, on a separate page, the Marchmont addendum. That secondary clause, the elegant little mechanism designed to funnel Rosalind's inheritance straight back to her uncle. Damian signed the certificate. He signed the discharge. He signed the settlement. Then he set the pen down, picked up the addendum, and tore it in half. His counsel lurched forward. Damian, you cannot. Fairfax will. Fairfax is not the chairman of Sterling Capital. My wife's inheritance is hers. Rosalind, to the council, tell my uncle I'm enjoying the Hudson Valley air. And tell him I have not forgotten the Connecticut property. Margaret collected her portfolio and left without another word. Thomas released a long, slow breath into the silence. Right. So, war then. Not for long, Rosalind said. Come with me. She led them to the East Wing guest suite. To her single piece of luggage, slim, expensive, the kind of bag that speaks of a woman who was permitted to bring very little. She turned it face down. Her fingers moved along the interior base. 3 pressure points. A soft click. A hidden panel no wider than a paperback. Inside, a flash drive. And a handwritten index. Every file annotated in her own precise handwriting. Wire transfers. Shadow accounts. Board resolutions backdated. Correspondence between Fairfax and the director of the private psychiatric facility. And at the bottom, flagged in red ink. Fire Marshal Preliminary Report, November 2019. Accelerant traces, East Wing, origin point. Interior consistent with deliberate ignition. Suppressed from final report. Thomas said what everyone was thinking. This isn't just civil fraud. This is federal criminal. Rosalind looked at Damian. We don't go to one regulator he can manage. We go to all of them at once. And the press simultaneously. She paused. His greatest weapon has always been controlling the narrative before anyone else sets the terms. Damian looked at her, at this woman who had sat alone in a house in Greenwich for 4 years with a flash drive taped inside a suitcase, waiting with the patience of someone who understood that the only move was the one that couldn't be undone. He understood for the first time the full cost of that patience. Pack your bag, Rosalind. We leave for New York in an hour. We are not hiding in the Hudson Valley. What I'm about to describe to you is one of the most satisfying things I have ever had the pleasure of narrating. Are you ready? Because she walked into his party. That same night, Harrison Fairfax was hosting his annual foundation gala. Park Avenue, 400 guests, board directors from Marchmont Private, 3 federal appellate judges, 2 sitting senators, the editor-in-chief of the Financial Review. It was supposed to be his celebration, the night after he received confirmation that his plan had worked perfectly, that the contract was signed, that Rosalind was contained, that the $900 million was as good as his. Instead, Thomas had spent the hours since the ceremony working every contact in his phone. And as 2 cars' worth of strategy rode south toward Manhattan, Damian was already coordinating with a federal prosecutor. Everything was being set in motion simultaneously, the way Rosalind had always said it needed to be. At Sterling House, Rosalind dressed. She chose a gown of midnight silk and black lace from the wardrobe Damian's late mother had maintained there, selecting it with the calm efficiency of someone suiting up for battle. At her throat, a single strand of diamonds from the estate's safe. Cold. Brilliant. She did not look like a woman who had been isolated and managed and underestimated for 4 years. She looked like the rightful heir to something, arriving to collect it. The car arrived at Park Avenue, the line of black vehicles, the blaze of light behind tall windows, the muffled string quartet. Damian adjusted his cuffs, looked at his wife. The doorman announced them into the ballroom. And 400 of America's most powerful people, mid-conversation, mid-champagne, mid-laughter, went silent in the span of 2 seconds. The string quartet faltered. A single violin scraped a discordant note and stopped. The crowd separated. At the far end of the room, holding a flute of champagne, silver-haired and impeccable, stood Harrison Fairfax. And as his eyes found Rosalind across the length of that beautiful, silent room, the glass went very still in his hand. All the blood left his face at once. They walked down the center of the ballroom, unhurried, footsteps audible on marble in the unnatural quiet. 400 pairs of eyes tracking them through the parted crowd. Fairfax recovered fast, with the practiced speed of a man who had spent 60 years controlling rooms. He stepped forward, his face rearranging itself in a theatrical anguish, his voice cracking for the room. "Fairfax, to the crowd, someone call security. She is not well." "She is not. Rosalind," cutting across the room. "I am entirely well, uncle. I have, in fact, never been better." Murmurs swept through the crowd, and Rosalind kept going. She told them everything. The isolation, the psychiatric facility, the years of engineered silence. She told them what it was really for. And Damian reached in his jacket, held up the flash drive, calm and deliberate, and named the Marchmont directors standing in that very room. The men who went white, who leaned toward each other with an urgency that confirmed everything. The fire marshal's preliminary report from November 2019 is also on this drive. Accelerant traces, deliberate ignition, suppressed from the final official record. The investigator who filed the final report resigned 4 months later and joined a consulting firm owned by a Fairfax subsidiary. The room erupted, and the federal prosecutor Thomas had spent 3 hours stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, with a grand jury subpoena and an SEC colleague waiting outside. And Harrison Fairfax, patriarch, architect, the man who had built a prison out of legal language and kept a woman in it for 4 years, looked at the exits, looked at the journalists reaching for phones, looked at his Marchmont directors calculating distances to doors, and something ugly and animal broke through the surface of him. He lunged, not toward Damian, toward Rosalind. His hand closed around a heavy crystal awards trophy from the table beside him. He swung it. Damian moved before the room could process it. He stepped directly into the arc of the swing. The crystal connected with his left shoulder. With an impact, the front rose heard clearly. He did not go down. He used the momentum. 1 precise right cross. And Harrison Fairfax collapsed onto the marble floor of his own gala, in a heap of bespoke tailoring and shattered pretension. The room held its breath. Damian stood over him, rolled his injured shoulder once, and turned back to his wife. And for the first time since that rain-soaked moment in the Hudson Valley driveway, Rosalind's composure cracked. Just slightly. Her eyes were wide, and there was something in them she hadn't allowed before. He offered her his arm, the good one this time. She took it. Her grip was tight, and he said, "Come, Mrs. Sterling. I believe this party has ended." He stepped in front of a crystal trophy for her, in front of 400 people. "I cannot. Stay for the ending. I promise you it is worth it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. We are 2 minutes from the most satisfying ending I have ever covered." In the car back to Sterling House, Rosalind moved across the seat without asking, sat beside him, and with a careful, unhurried competence that caught him completely off guard, she assessed his shoulder through the wool of his jacket. "Not broken," she said. "Deeply bruised. The cut above your collarbone is bleeding through your shirt. You didn't have to do that." "Damian, you are my wife," he said. The word landed between them with a weight neither had prepared for, and Rosalind's hands went still against his chest. In the amber wash of passing streetlights, her face was very close, and entirely unguarded, for the first time since he'd known her. "A contract of convenience," she said quietly. But it didn't sound like a correction. It sounded like a question. He reached up, with his good hand, and brushed a strand of dark hair back from her temple. His thumb grazed the silver scar, just below her hairline. "He took 4 years from you. I was not going to let him take anything else." She was silent for a long moment, and then, carefully, deliberately, as though placing something very valuable down on an uncertain surface, she rested her head against his good shoulder. Just that, just the weight of her against him, in the amber-lit dark, while New York moved past the windows. Neither of them spoke for the rest of the drive. The weeks that followed were a reckoning. The flash drive went to the DOJ, the SEC, and 3 financial journalists simultaneously. The story broke across every wire service within 48 hours. Harrison Fairfax was arrested at his Park Avenue apartment on a Thursday morning, before the markets opened. Assets frozen by noon. The Financial Review ran it on the front page. One headline: The Ghost of Greenwich. Rosalind sat for the interview herself, in the Sterling Capitol boardroom, in front of people who had written her off as a footnote, and she took apart every premise of a narrative her uncle had spent 5 years building. Sentence by meticulous sentence. The $900 million trust, every dollar diverted, laundered, rerouted, was recovered and placed in her name. Sterling Capital's debt was discharged. The firm had its best fiscal year in a decade. The Sterling name held. And then, 6 weeks later, the annulment paper arrived. Damian sat with them in his study for a long time. He heard her footsteps in the corridor. She saw the envelope on the desk. He told her both signatures, and they'd process it quietly. She'd have the legal separation before Christmas. He kept his voice even, each word an act of discipline. She picked up the envelope, turned it over in her hands, and walked to the fireplace, and dropped it in. It caught, curled, bloomed orange, and was gone in 10 seconds. The choice, Rosalind. I spent 4 years deciding that freedom meant being alone and untethered. I was right about some of it. I was wrong about the most important part. Rosalind continued, my uncle thought he was giving me a warden. He gave me the only person who looked at everything he'd built around me and decided, without obligation, without being asked, to walk into the middle of it and take the blow that was meant for me. Rosalind, finally, I don't want Florence. I want this. I want you. I want to stay. He kissed her, and it wasn't tentative. It wasn't polite. It was the kiss of two people who had arrived at each other through the wreckage of the worst things ever done to them, and found, improbably, impossibly, entirely against the terms of any reasonable arrangement, that they did not want to be anywhere else. Outside, the first snow of the season fell on Ashford Estate. Soft, silent, covering everything that came before in clean, unhurried white. Harrison Fairfax was convicted on 11 federal counts. He received a 12-year sentence and died 2 years into it. The Fairfax Group was dissolved. Its assets, reclaimed under federal oversight, funded a nonprofit legal advocacy organization established in the name of Rosalind's father, providing counsel to individuals whose financial interests had been suppressed by family members with power of attorney. It was, Rosalind told a reporter the afternoon of its launch, the most useful thing the Fairfax name had ever been attached to. 2 years after a rain-lashed town car had pulled up to Ashford and a woman had stepped out of it and broken every expectation he had ever formed, Damian found Rosalind in the library at her father's desk, surrounded by estate records, 2 laptops, architectural plans for the East Wing renovation, a half-empty cup of tea gone cold, entirely absorbed, entirely radiant, entirely, unmistakably home. He set a fresh cup of tea on the desk without a word. She looked up, and in her green eyes, those extraordinary, relentless, undefeatable green eyes, was everything that had survived 4 years of being told it didn't exist. He had said, standing at a window 40 floors up, watching a car he did not understand arrive in the rain below, that she cannot be his bride. He had never been more spectacularly wrong about anything in his life, and he thanked God for it every single day. If this story hit you the way it hit me, please share this video. Send it to your group chat. Send it to the person who needs a story about a woman who survived, strategized, and won. And if you want more stories like this every week, subscribe, hit the bell. I will see you in the next one.